Thank you, Mr. President. I come to the floor to urge my colleagues to vote no on the nomination of Bernard McNamee to be the member of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. And I thank my colleague from Oregon for being out here explaining why this nomination matters and why my colleagues on both sides of the aisle should turn it down. This is a very important time as we move forward on energy policy in the United States, but I'm pretty sure my constituents, well, actually, my constituents probably do know who the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is. That's because when it came to the Enron crisis, they had to count on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to make sure that energy markets were properly policed. And in the end, they did do that, basically protecting consumers for what are unjust and unreasonable rates. But the fact is that a lot of Americans don't understand who the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is. That's because the job of the Commission can range from a broad overseeing and reliability of the electricity grid to ensuring that wholesale electricity and natural gas rates are just and reasonable. That was what we argued in the Enron case. They were going to make utilities pay for 9 years on what were fraudulent contracts, and we emphasized how could fraudulent Enron contracts ever be just and reasonable if they had admitted to manipulating them. But the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission also oversees licensings of hydroelectric dams, approving of construction of natural gas pipelines, also relying on FERC to protect the electric and national gas markets, as I mentioned, from manipulation. We ended up putting even stronger language in to make sure that the definition of manipulation was there and that people were protected. I remember my colleagues from Texas joining me in getting that language actually passed. Why? Because they knew exactly how much the Enron manipulation had cost all of us in our economy. These are important responsibilities, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and the members of this commission should have the due diligence of their record done by members of the United States Senate. These are important decisions that affect many energy projects and how people will pay to heat their homes and keep the lights on. It also is about how we protect our energy infrastructure for the future. And trust me, the amount of cyber attacks that are going on in energy markets alone would make you want to have great oversight of these nominees. But it's important that the Commission also just remain its role of independent and impartial, because it is a quasi-judicial role. That is, they act like judges and they need to be impartial, making decisions about important energy projects that get built around the United States. For this reason, one of the qualifications written into the law creating the Commission is that members, quote, be individuals who have demonstrated the ability, background, training, and experience, and who are specifically qualified to assess fairly the needs and concerns of all interested and affected by federal energy policy, end quote. That's an important section because it is that issue of accessing fairly the needs and concerns of all interested parties in making these quasi-judicial opinions. I would also add that it is the duty of the Senate to make sure that these commissions are free from political influence. I know that from time to time people have been on the Commission and there have been issues about how those on the outside have tried to influence them, and we will continue to make sure that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission remains above this kind of political influence and that they remain unbiased as decision makers in these important policies. I believe that this nominee, Mr. McNamee, does not meet this standard. I believe that he is too ideologically motivated to continue on what really needs to be a fact-based decision-making model on outcomes that affect people's individual energy rates. The Commission have to police and regulate energy markets without regard to fuel source, market power, or having a political lens. And I want to see commissioners who, in my mind, should have the words that are in the Federal Power Act, just and reasonable rates, practically tattooed into their psyche. Why? Because that is the standard by which you judge these projects. Like many of my colleagues, I've been troubled by this administration's effort to try to subsidize high-cost coal-fired power plants at the expense of American ratepayers. According to a July report, experts at the Brattle Group said the administration's bailout plan would have cost consumers $34 billion over 2 years. $34 billion that American consumers don't have. How would they have done that? By saying that you had to have coal projects as a way to keep the grid reliable. Well, I disagreed with that. Many members, I would say probably many members of the Energy Committee disagreed with that, and clearly members of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, as is currently comprised, also disagreed with that. Why was it such an adamant reaction? Because it's almost as if you were saying, instead of letting the market make these decisions, people were going to force utilities to do projects that included coal and putting coal onto the grid, even though the renewable energy was driving down cost and helping consumers diversify. This is important because the bailout proponents have argued that baseload coal is needed to ensure that the grid is always working. Well, when you look at this analysis, it did not hold up under the scrutiny. Popping up and trying to prop up uneconomical coal plants for the sake of the reliability of the grid is a fake rationale that the administration tried to use, and it would have impacted the free market and consumers. I know that our competition as manufacturers, because we have a lot of manufacturers in the state of Washington, they rely on affordable hydro to help drive down the cost of manufacturing. I think the cost of doing business and electricity rates all through the United States are going to be a key issue for how we drive our competitiveness in manufacturing for the future. So I certainly don't want to see a mandate by this administration saying that you have to use coal and driving up the costs for that manufacturing base and for our consumers. A fuel security report issued last month by what is called the PJM interconnection, that's the Pennsylvania, New Jersey, all the way to Illinois, found that this report, basically by this energy interconnection, basically how power is sold and people who are responsible for operating the grid, they found in their report there was no need to prop up unhistorical, uneconomical power plants, that they were confident that the grid, the world's largest competitive wholesale electricity market, would remain reliable. And that is that it would remain reliable over the next 5 years without this mandate of coal. So as the modeling shows, this is a very important issue, and it has nothing to do with the temperature outside, that even in a severe cold snap, that the grid would continue to operate. In fact, the Washington Examiner, hardly a newspaper I quote a lot on the Senate floor, but I am going to in this case, basically said, quote, the largest power grid operator dismisses the threat of coal and nuclear power plant closures. So they were referring to this report. They were referring to the PJM report that basically says, no, we don't have to worry about our grid reliability, and that this report dismisses the notion that the coal plant closures would somehow put us all at risk. So what does that proposal have to do with Mr. McNamee, people are asking? Well, as a senior political appointment at the Department of Energy, Mr. McNamee had a key role in promoting and defending this policy. He had a hand in ignoring the other experts at DOE who basically told him that these facts were wrong. And he ignored the fact that this would place an undue burden on ratepayers, and as I mentioned, an undue burden as it would impact our economy moving forward. He ignored the fact that we are seeing changes in clean energy markets, that they are cheaper and more effective than coal, and that this proposal, even though he continued to push it, was not going to help us keep an open and free market when it came to electricity. Part of what the energy regulators do is make decisions about projects moving forward that are based on what the market is bringing to them, based on pure economics. Their job is to determine the return and the rates that consumers would be impacted by. That is where the term just and reasonable comes into play. Their job is not to pick winners and losers in the market. Their job is to determine whether there will be just and reasonable rates for the individual consumers in those markets. it's their job to make sure that there aren't excessive prices and that there is true competition in the market, not to favor a high-cost fuel source like coal and try to protect it from other fuel sources that might be more economical for consumers. So, as the Supreme Court has said, FERC is the guardian of the public interest in these matters. Their commissioners are to protect the public interest, not private interest, and to make sure that there are fuel supplies for the future. So I view this threat of really trying to disrupt the market, the free market, as one of the most important things that we need to continue to protect. Why? Because innovation does shift over time, and we are trying to figure out decisions about distributed energy. And there will be major discussions by the Energy Commission about how to achieve that, particularly as we deal with the impacts of climate change. So our historic energy system is at an inflection point, but it doesn't mean we should hold on to more expensive sources of generating electricity. It means that we should make sure that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission do its job as a quasi-judicial branch of not being politically motivated or coming up with issues that are not market-based rate solutions. So, yes, we have had a decline in the cost of wind. It's declined an incredibly 69% over the last 9 years, solar a whopping 88%. If coal or nuclear costs had dropped that much, we would be having a different conversation, but they haven't. And even in states where coal has been a big part of the mix, the Northern Indiana Public Service Company found that building renewables is cheaper than keeping existing coal plants open. So even these utilities in areas that could be impacted have found that these reports are very concerning. According to one company's report in 2018, Integrated Resource Plan found that they could save their constituents $4 billion over 30 years by ramping down the amount of coal they use from 2/3 of their generation to 15% by 2023, and eliminating coal entirely by 2028. So I would like to have taken Mr. McNamee at his word when he came before the Senate Energy Committee to say that he would be, quote, a fair and objective and impartial arbiter. That is what you want from a Federal Energy Regulatory Commissioner. He also said that he would decide matters coming before him based on the law and not based on politics. But after his committee hearing, which I remained still very concerned about, we asked further questions, and research found a video of a speech Mr. McNamee gave on fossil fuels earlier in the year, and I believe that shows that he has a continued bias beyond the president asking him to draft such a rule and try to push it through the Federal Department of Energy, even when scientists and others were telling him that the facts just did not support their report. Mr. McNamee's words reveal a very strong bias in favor of fossil fuels against renewable energy. For example, he claimed that fossil fuels are, quote, the key not only to our prosperity, but to a clean environment, end quote. And he basically continued to make comments that I think are demonstrably false. Now, he's free as a private citizen to say whatever he wants, but when you are hired to put a report out and you have scientists within the agency correcting your false information, continuing to push these ideas, I think, puts you in a different category. Hard to believe that you will be quasi-judicial and a fair arbitrator. I know that he has had many conversations, including the information in the video. One of the most striking is when he said, quote, the green energy movement is always talking about more government control because it's the constant battle between liberty and tyranny, and then to say that his son should, quote, just deny climate science even if it hurts the boys' grades. So these are not the words or sentiments, I believe, of someone who is going to play that role of an arbiter for the Federal Energy Regulatory Policy. These policies will come up before the Commission. I know the administration plans on continuing to try to find ways to have coal mandated into the market instead of allowing the free market to take place. So I want to make sure that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission does not subject itself to some sort of bias in this process. If Mr. McNamee becomes a Federal Energy Regulatory Commissioner and he continues to try to overturn relevant FERC decisions in court by arguing against these things, what kind of process will we see at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in response to his biases? To me, you have the threat of legal uncertainty. Projects could be put on hold, investments could be further delayed, grid reliability rules could be impacted. Why? Because he's right? No, because people already believe his previous statements has biased him in his approach in the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. These energy policies, particularly the area of cybersecurity, are going to be so critical for us to move forward on. Every day, our grid is impacted by these attacks by foreign entities. It is so important that we get about the task of making our grid more reliable and better protected against cybersecurity, not getting weighed down in a bunch of arguments against someone who does not appear, in my opinion, to have that quasi-judicial approach to making sure that the market and the market decisions are fair and reasonable and just and reasonable rates for consumers. All of this is particularly distressing as Mr. McNamee's speech surfaced just days before the U.S. Global Climate Change Research released its quadrennial review report. Why is this important? Well, because we can see that the cost to the federal government and to individual citizens are being impacted here in the United States. We all know that we need to have a diverse source of energy mixes. We know that we have to do better than what we are doing today. But by pushing Mr. McNamee's name forward, it is simply trying to hold on to the past. Those individual tragedies, as I mentioned, could cost taxpayers by a continued reliance on fossil fuel in the trillions of dollars over the next few decades. The climate assessment basically said that they estimate that we do nothing, that by the end of the century, the impacts will cost the United States upward of $500 billion a year in crop damage, labor loss, and extreme weather damages. So we can't afford that. We need to keep moving forward, and we need to let the market do its job. So for over 40 years, this independent and impartial Energy Regulatory Commission has provided Americans with decades of fuel-neutral competition, resulting, as I said, in those just and reasonable rates. Now, thankfully, technology advances are helping us step up to new opportunities, but still while having that commission oversee based on just and reasonable rates to make sure that we are doing all that we can to hold down the cost to consumers and move things forward in energy markets. So I ask my colleagues to review the video and the video remarks of this nominee, to come to the Senate floor and vote against this nominee in hopes that we can get someone else to take this job at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. I hope my colleagues realize the importance of this before it's too late, and that we will move forward on someone that can help us continue to have a Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Clearly, this is not viewed as just politics on our side. There are many people who are on the Federal Regulatory Commission that have very strong political backgrounds, one that used to work right here in the United States Senate. And so this is not about that. This is about somebody having the quasi-judicial behavior to review these issues and not advocating at all costs a market eroding notion that coal must be purchased by utilities, raising rates on consumers. I thank the President, and I yield the floor.